Some photographs preserve moments. They hold smiles in place. They trap birthdays, weddings, faces that time will eventually erase. Others preserve errors, not mistakes made by the photographer, but mistakes made by reality itself. In the summer of 1902, in a quiet hillside village near Lucca, Italy, a photograph was taken inside a stone house that no longer stands. There is no plaque where it once was, no record of its demolition. Locals simply say the ground became unsuitable, as if the earth itself had rejected what happened there. At the time, there was nothing remarkable about the house. Thick limestone walls, narrow windows, a front room that smelled faintly of oil, dust, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It was the kind of place people lived entire lives in without ever imagining it would be remembered. The photograph was meant to be ordinary, a family portrait, 5 figures arranged carefully before a painted backdrop. One of those backdrops that tried to imitate elegance it could never fully achieve. A suggestion of columns, a distant countryside that did not resemble the land outside the window, a world cleaner than the one they actually inhabited. The family sat and stood exactly as instructed, still, proper, silent. This mattered because photography in 1902 was not forgiving. Exposure required patience. Any movement became distortion. Any breath too deep could leave a ghost where a face should be. The photographer warned them clearly. 8 seconds, he said. Do not move. 8 seconds. It does not sound like much, but in silence, with the weight of expectation pressing down, 8 second stretches. The father straightened his shoulders. The mother adjusted her hands, then forced them to remain still. The children stared forward, eyes already beginning to burn from the effort of not blinking. And somewhere inside that room, unseen, unacknowledged, something else became aware of the pause. The exposure lasted 8 seconds, long enough for breathing to slow, long enough for muscles to stiffen, long enough for the human body to forget motion and become something closer to an object, long enough for the air itself to feel heavy. No one would later remember exactly when the temperature dropped, only that it did, subtly, gradually. A creeping chill that slid across the stone floor and gathered around their feet. It did not rush. It did not announce itself. It waited. The photographer adjusted the lens, peering through the viewfinder, seeing only what he expected to see. A family, aligned neatly within the frame. 5 faces, 5 presences, nothing more. What he could not see was the space between them, the narrow gap between 2 children, the sliver of shadow behind their shoulders. The way that shadow seemed just slightly too dense, as if light struggled to pass through it. If anyone had moved, if a child had shifted, or a parent had turned their head, something might have changed. But they did not. They obeyed. The shutter opened. For 8 seconds, the room held its breath, and during those 8 seconds, something unseen made a decision. At the time, no one noticed anything unusual. How could they? There was no sound, no sudden movement, no dramatic interruption, no scream, no flickering candle, no sign that the moment had been compromised. That is how these things endure, not by force, but by permission. The shutter closed. The photographer covered the lens and nodded, satisfied. Another successful portrait, another family preserved, as they wished to be seen, whole, proper, complete. The family relaxed, shoulders dropped. Children blinked and shifted, rubbing their eyes. The mother exhaled, without realizing she had been holding her breath. The father thanked the photographer politely, The room returned to normal. At least, that is how it felt. No one noticed the faint residue of cold lingering near the chair where no one had been sitting. No one noticed that the silence lasted a fraction of a second longer than it should have. No one noticed that the house itself seemed to settle, as if accommodating an additional presence it had not planned for. The photographer packed his equipment methodically, wooden camera secured, glass plates wrapped carefully in cloth. These plates were fragile, expensive, and irreplaceable. They were also honest. Glass does not interpret, it records. As the photographer stepped outside, sunlight returned its warmth to his skin. The chill of the house faded quickly, dismissed as imagination or the nature of stone walls that rarely held heat. He had no reason to suspect anything had gone wrong. He had taken hundreds of photographs before. Families, couples, children, funerals. He had seen blurred hands, doubled eyes, half-vanished faces caused by nervous movement. This felt no different. But the photograph had already been altered. Not by motion, not by light, by presence. Later, when people would try to trace the moment something changed, they would point to the development process, to the dark room, to the instant the image appeared on the glass plate like a memory surfacing from blackness. But the truth is simpler. The photograph was wrong the moment the shutter closed. The glass plate, still wrapped and unseen, carried something it had not been meant to hold. It carried more than silver salts and chemical reactions. It carried evidence of a hesitation, an overlap between what was there and what should not have been. At the time, no one noticed anything unusual. The family returned to their routines. The photographer walked down the road toward the next village. The house stood quietly, its windows dark, its walls unchanged. Nothing screamed, nothing broke, nothing demanded attention. That came later, much later, when the photograph was finally developed, when the red glow of the darkroom revealed not 5 faces, but 6, and when the mistake, the preserved error, looked back. The Bianchi family lived the way most families did in the countryside, by routine rather than choice. Matteo Bianchi rose before sunrise every morning, not because he enjoyed the quiet, but because the land demanded it. The olive terraces did not care about fatigue or grief. They needed tending. They needed hands that knew where to cut and where to wait. Matteo had learned early that work was the safest way to keep thoughts from wandering. He spoke little while he worked. The sound of tools against soil was enough. Sophia kept the house in much the same way. The floors were swept daily, even when they did not appear dirty. The linens were washed on a schedule that never changed. Meals were prepared carefully, portions measured, waste avoided. The house was not unhappy, but it was restrained, as if emotion itself had been placed under the same rules as cleanliness. Their children understood these rules without them ever being spoken. Luca, the eldest, learned early when silence was required. He watched his parents closely, adjusting his behavior to their moods, stepping lightly through rooms that felt too quiet to disturb. Amelia followed his example, copying not just what to do, but what not to ask. Paolo, still young enough to forget himself, was corrected gently but firmly when his curiosity lingered too long. Questions were not forbidden. They were discouraged. This was not cruelty. It was survival. They prayed together each evening, kneeling on the same worn floorboards, voices murmuring familiar words. The prayers were not passionate, they were precise. A ritual meant to maintain order rather than invite reflection. Faith in the Bianchi household was something you followed carefully, so it would not notice you too closely. 3 years earlier, that balance had been tested. Behind the church, where the ground sloped away from the main road and the soil remained cool even in summer, something had been buried. Not much, not heavy, but significant enough that everyone involved agreed the burial should be brief. It was done at dawn. There were no bells to announce it, no formal gathering, no procession. The church doors remained closed. The village continued its morning routines, unaware or pretending to be. Only the priest was present. Only the family stood nearby. Only the earth bore witness. No name was spoken aloud, not because it had not been chosen, but because saying it would have made the loss real in a way they were not prepared to endure. The priest spoke softly. He said the soul was innocent. He said there was nothing to fear. He said that some lives passed through the world too quickly to leave marks. He did not linger. When it was over, the ground was smoothed carefully. No stone was placed, no marker remained. From a distance, it looked like any other patch of earth behind the church. From close enough, the soil always seemed slightly disturbed. After that day, the family returned home and continued living. This was the important part. They did not collapse into mourning. They did not speak endlessly of what had happened. They did not argue with God or question the fairness of it all. They continued. Neighbors commented on how strong Sophia was, how quickly she returned to her duties, how quietly she bore her loss. Matteo accepted their words with a nod. Strength, after all, was easier than grief. The children were told very little, only what was necessary, only what could be explained without inviting further curiosity. Something had happened. It was sad. It was over. And that was that. Except it wasn't. The house remembered in ways people did not. There were small adjustments no one could fully explain. Sophia began leaving one extra place, setting on the table before correcting herself. She folded linens more often than required. She caught herself rocking gently while standing still, as if soothing something that was no longer there. Matteo avoided certain areas of the house without realizing it. He preferred to sit facing the door. He slept lighter than before, waking at the slightest sound, listening for something he could never name. The children noticed things they could not articulate. Luca sometimes felt watched when passing through the hallway at night. Emilia avoided a particular corner of the house without knowing why. Paolo, still too young to understand restraint, spoke occasionally of dreams where someone cried without sound. These moments were dismissed. Children imagined things. That was easier than admitting the alternative. The house itself remained quiet. It did not creak more than usual. It did not produce unexplained noises or obvious disturbances. It did not demand attention. Instead, it absorbed. Stone walls are good at that. They hold temperature. They hold sound. They hold memory. Over time, the family learned to live around an absence that felt oddly specific. It was not the vague emptiness left by loss. It was more precise than that. A missing weight, a space that felt measured, as if something had been removed carefully rather than torn away. No one spoke of it. Silence became a skill. Meals were eaten without lingering. Conversations stayed practical. Laughter, when it occurred, was brief and subdued, as if excessive joy might draw notice. Even grief, when it surfaced, was handled quietly. Sophia cried alone. Matteo clenched his jaw and worked longer hours. The children learned to recognize when it was better to stay out of sight. This was how the family stayed intact. This was how they believed safety worked. What they did not understand was that silence does not erase things. It preserves them by refusing to speak, by refusing to name, by refusing to acknowledge what had passed briefly through their lives. The Bianchis had not closed a door. They had left it slightly open, and the house, patient, attentive, had kept track. Years passed. The routines held. The absence remained. And when the photographer arrived with his camera and glass plates, offering to capture the family exactly as they were, they agreed without hesitation, because the idea of being seen as whole was comforting, because a photograph could suggest completion, because 5 figures arranged carefully before a painted backdrop felt correct, felt controlled, felt safe. They did not consider what might happen when something that had never been acknowledged finally found a way to be seen. The priest had said there was nothing to fear. The house had said nothing at all. And silence, as the Bianchi family would soon learn, is not reassurance. It is waiting. On June 17th, the photographer arrived shortly after midday, when the sun sat high enough to flood the village with light, but not yet strong enough to bleach color from the stone walls. He came on foot, his equipment loaded carefully into a wooden case that bore the scratches of long travel. Villages like this were familiar to him, places where people lived close to the land and farther from records, where photographs still carried a sense of ceremony. He introduced himself politely and explained his work with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to skepticism. A portrait, he said, was a way to be remembered accurately, not as memory softened things, not as grief reshaped them, but as they were. The Bianchis listened in silence. They did not ask questions about the process. They did not inquire how long it would take. Matteo only nodded once, slowly, as if agreeing to something he had already decided long ago. Sophia hesitated for a fraction of a second before agreeing. It was brief enough that no one commented on it. Inside the house, the photographer assessed the light with professional care. Windows were narrow. Stone walls absorbed more brightness than they reflected. He chose the front room, the one with the least clutter, the one that felt contained. Curtains were drawn carefully, adjusted inch by inch to soften the glare. Too much light would ruin the exposure. Too little would distort the faces. Photography, he explained, was a matter of balance. Chairs were positioned with deliberate precision, each one aligned to the frame the photographer envisioned in his mind. The children were seated first, Luca in the center, Emilia to one side, Paolo to the other. Small adjustments were made, chin lifted, shoulders squared, feet placed flat on the floor. Matteo and Sophia were positioned behind them, hands on the shoulders, the photographer instructed. Matteo complied immediately. Sophia hesitated again, just long enough to register as uncertainty rather than defiance. When she placed her hands, they rested lightly, almost protectively, as if afraid of applying too much pressure. The room felt quieter than it had moments before. Not silent, just expectant. The photographer adjusted his camera, peering through the lens. He frowned slightly, not in concern, but concentration. The frame was correct, the alignment precise. 5 figures, balanced and symmetrical. Still, he adjusted the angle once more. And then again, he could not explain the sensation that prompted it, only that something about the space felt slightly uneven, as if the room itself resisted settling into the shape he required. He dismissed the thought. Old houses were like that. He instructed the family to look forward, not directly at the lens, but just above it. This prevented strain, he explained, prevented unnatural expressions. The children obeyed. Luca's jaw tightened as he focused. Amelia's eyes widened, already fighting the instinct to blink. Paolo fidgeted briefly, then froze when his father's hand pressed down just enough to remind him to be still. "Do not move," the photographer said. His voice was calm, practiced, unremarkable. 8 seconds, he explained. That was all. 8 seconds. It sounded simple, but as the shutter opened, time changed its behavior. The first second passed normally. Breathing slowed naturally as everyone settled into stillness. The second stretched slightly, muscles beginning to protest the unnatural restraint. By the third second, the room felt different, cooler, not enough to be alarming, just enough to be noticeable. The cold did not come from the walls or the window. It rose from the floor, thin and deliberate, sliding across stone as if testing the space. It reached the children's feet first, lingering there before moving on. No one spoke. No one shifted. By the 4th second, the air felt heavier. Breaths grew shallower without anyone consciously deciding to change them. The silence thickened, pressing inward rather than outward. Sophia felt it then, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with posture, a sensation she had not felt in years. Not fear exactly, recognition. She did not turn her head. She did not dare. By the 5th second, the cold reached higher, brushing ankles, curling faintly around chair legs. It was not uncomfortable. It was intimate. The kind of cold that does not shock, but lingers, as if learning the shape of what it touches. The photographer's brow furrowed. Something in the frame had changed. He could not say what. The 6th second dragged. Luca's eyes burned. Amelia's breath caught slightly, though she did not exhale. Paolo's foot twitched, but stopped before it became movement. Matteo felt pressure beneath his hands, not from the children, from something else, as if another set of shoulders had leaned forward just enough to be included. He did not react. Years of restraint had taught him the value of pretending nothing was wrong. The 7th second was the longest. The silence felt deliberate now, structured, like a held breath that did not belong to any one person in the room. The house listened. The space between the children seemed occupied, not filled, acknowledged. And then, finally, the 8th second arrived. The shutter closed. The sound was sharp, mechanical, final. The moment was sealed. The air shifted immediately. The weight lifted. The cold receded, withdrawing back into the stone floor as quietly as it had come. Breaths were released. Paolo blinked first. Amelia followed, exhaling sharply. Luca flexed his fingers in his lap. Sophia swallowed. The photographer stepped back from the camera, satisfaction returning to his expression. Whatever unease he had felt dissipated now that the task was complete. "Very good," he said. "You held perfectly." He began packing his equipment, unaware that his hands were moving faster than usual. The family relaxed, conversation resuming in careful fragments. The room felt normal again, ordinary, but something subtle had changed. The space between the chairs felt narrower. The silence lingered longer after voices stopped, and no one noticed that the photograph, still unseen, still latent within the glass plate, already contained on more than they remembered posing for. The moment had been sealed, and something that had waited patiently for years had finally been allowed to stand still long enough to be recorded. That evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the hills, the photographer prepared his workspace. It was a narrow room rented above a baker's shop, chosen for its lack of windows and its distance from the street. Thick shutters sealed out stray light. The only illumination came from a single red lamp hanging low over a rough wooden table. Beneath it sat the tools of his trade: glass plates wrapped in cloth, chemical trays, a basin of water drawn earlier that day. This was the part of the process he trusted most. The camera could lie, people could lie, but development revealed what had truly been captured. He worked methodically, his movements practiced, almost ritualistic. Each plate was handled with care, edges touched lightly to avoid fingerprints. He had performed this routine hundreds of times, enough that his hands often moved ahead of his thoughts. The Bianchi plate was no different. At first, he lowered the glass into the developer solution and watched as the surface darkened. The image began to emerge slowly, like a memory surfacing from sleep. Shadows first, then outlines, then faces. He counted them automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The number felt correct. He relaxed slightly, leaning back as the details sharpened. The children's expressions were exactly as he remembered: controlled, restrained, almost severe. The parents stood behind them, hands placed carefully, postures upright. It was a good portrait. Then his eyes adjusted, and the number changed. 5 faces became 6. The photographer did not react immediately. He blinked once, slowly, as if expecting the image to correct itself. Sometimes chemical reactions produced temporary distortions, ghosting, overlapping shadows that resolved as development continued. This did not resolve. He leaned closer to the tray. Between the 2 older children, between Luca and Emilia, slightly behind them, a 6th face was forming. It was unmistakably a child. The proportions were wrong for an adult, the features too small, too delicate, the head positioned just far enough back that it did not disrupt the composition at first glance. It had been careful. The face was pale, not washed out by light, but pale in the way skin becomes when blood no longer moves beneath it. Its expression was neutral, almost curious. The mouth hung slightly open, as if caught between speech and silence, but it was the eyes that stopped him. They were open wider than the others, not strained, alert, focused. They were not looking at the lens. They were not looking forward at all. They were angled upward, toward the woman, standing behind the children, toward Sophia. The photographer's breath caught in his throat. He straightened, then leaned in again, angling the plate to catch the red light more clearly. Perhaps it was a reflection. Perhaps a chemical irregularity, mimicking features. But reflections did not have symmetry. Chemical flaws did not stare. He checked the edges of the glass, searching for evidence of overlap. Double exposures usually left signs: misaligned borders, blurred contours, faint echoes of movement. There were none. The 6th face was sharp as the others, as real. His mind raced through explanations. Another plate, reused accidentally. Impossible. He was meticulous about cleaning. A child passing through the frame. No movement had been allowed. And the exposure time, would have blurred any intrusion beyond recognition. A flaw in the glass itself? The surface was smooth, unblemished. The longer he stared, the more certain he became of something he did not want to accept. This face had not been added. It had been included. The photograph had not been altered. It had been completed. The room felt colder, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough that he noticed his fingers stiffening slightly at the edges. He lifted the plate from the solution, holding it up to the red light. The image was fully formed now. 6 faces, all correctly proportioned, all properly aligned. The 6th face sat where there should have been empty space, as if the space had always been reserved. The photographer swallowed and told himself what any reasonable man would. It was a mistake, a double exposure he had somehow failed to notice, a technical anomaly that defied immediate explanation, but would reveal itself with time and distance. He set the plate aside and reached for the discard bin. The decision felt sudden, instinctive. This image should not exist. He gripped the plate firmly, intending to snap it cleanly in half, rendering it unusable. Glass plates broke easily when mishandled. He had broken many before. He applied pressure. The plate cracked, but not where his hands were. A sharp line split the glass, clean, precise, tracing a rough oval around the unfamiliar face. The rest of the plate remained intact. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the small room. He froze. The broken shard slid slightly, separating from the rest of the image. The 6th face remained whole within its fragment, expression unchanged, eyes still lifted toward Sophia's position in the frame. The remaining portion of the photograph, 5 faces, undisturbed, stayed perfectly intact. His hands began to shake. Glass did not break like that, not without intent. He set the pieces down slowly, afraid that further contact might cause more damage or something worse. His mouth felt dry. The red light seemed dimmer now, as if the room were retreating from the image. He forced himself to look again. The 6th face appeared closer now, not physically larger, but more present. The eyes, still angled upward, seemed sharper, more defined, as if aware of having been seen. The photographer stepped back, bumping into the table behind him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He reminded himself again that this was impossible. And yet, he wrapped the intact portion of the plate in cloth without looking at it again. The fragment containing the extra face he hesitated over. For a moment, a brief, shameful moment, he considered keeping it. The thought came unbidden, as if the image had suggested it. He rejected the idea immediately, wrapping that fragment as well. Layers of cloth separating glass from air, sight from thought. He did not sleep that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the face emerging again, patient and intact. He imagined it watching from the darkness, waiting for the moment someone acknowledged it fully. At dawn, he returned to the Bianchi house. He did not explain himself. He did not mention the development process or the flaw he claimed to have discovered. He simply handed Sophia the wrapped photograph, his fingers lingering a second too long before releasing it. She took it without a word. Their eyes met briefly, and for an instant he was certain she already knew. He left quickly after that, his steps faster than necessary, his equipment packed with uncharacteristic haste. By the time he reached the edge of the village, he told himself he had done the right thing. The mistake was no longer his responsibility. But the truth was simpler. The photograph had never been wrong. It had only waited for the right moment to show what had always been standing there. Sophia did not ask. She did not speak, not immediately. Even as the photograph was placed in front of her, wrapped carefully in layers of cloth, a weight settled in her chest, a weight she recognized all too well. Her fingers hovered over the bundle, trembling slightly before they dared to touch it. The cloth was ordinary, the kind used to protect fragile glass, but her hands betrayed her. They betrayed the recognition that had come before sight, before explanation. She could feel it deep in her bones long before her eyes confirmed it. The unwrapping was slow, painfully deliberate, each layer peeled back like a promise or a warning. The cloth crackled softly under her fingers. For a moment, the room was silent, except for that small, intimate sound. When she saw it, she did not gasp. She did not scream. She did not even murmur a word. She recognized the shape of the face immediately, the narrow chin, the delicate curve of the lips, the faint mark near the left eye, barely noticeable unless you knew it had ever been there. Details she had glimpsed only once, during the briefest instant of memory she had tried desperately to forget. Details that belonged to someone who should never have been remembered. The photograph lay between them, a fragile rectangle of glass and silver salts, perfectly still, and yet charged with something immovable, something waiting. Matteo did not look at her. He did not meet her eyes. He reached out slowly and folded the photograph once, as if an ordinary action could contain the extraordinary. Then again, the folds did not change the truth the glass held. They did not diminish the presence. Yet the act of folding was a ritual, a denial, a way to pretend that reality could be contained. Finally, he placed it face down on the table. Only then did he speak. "Nonsense," he said. A single word, calm, deliberate. A word meant to smooth over the tension in the room. A word meant to keep things normal. But the word did nothing. It could not. Sophia's breathing was shallow, uneven. Her hands shook slightly, even as they rested in her lap. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, followed the table where the photograph had been set. Somewhere beneath the veneer of denial, something inside her recognized what she had feared all along. It was waiting. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual. Not empty exactly, but still. Too still. The sort of quiet that carries attention, that makes every creak of wood, every sigh of wind, every rustle in the dark feel amplified. Paolo slept fitfully in the small room at the end of the hall. The bed was modest, a simple frame with a thin mattress and blankets tucked carefully around the edges. Yet sleep offered no comfort. At some point, Sophia would never know exactly when, Paolo's soft whimpers turned into cries. Not the usual small noises of a child startled by a dream, but screams that cut sharply through the quiet. Sophia and Matteo rushed down the hall. She reached the room first and saw him sitting upright in the bed, his small body trembling, eyes wide in terror. "Paolo," she whispered, voice breaking slightly. He did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed somewhere near the foot of the bed, past the edges of the blankets, past the familiar corners of the room. He pointed with a trembling hand. "Someone," he said. His voice shook. "Someone is standing right there." Sophia's stomach tightened. She had been certain the boy would not remember the day. She had been careful to shield him from the memory. But now it seemed that whatever the photograph had captured did not obey caution, did not respect denial. "Who, Paolo?" she asked softly, trying to keep her own voice steady. The little one," he stammered. "Someone small, standing, smelling like damp soil." The words were strange, almost nonsensical to any adult who had not seen the photograph, and yet they made perfect sense to Sophia. She felt it immediately. The scent, the way it pressed against her memory. A smell she had not noticed for years but could never forget, the faint, earthy, unmistakably human scent that clung to graves freshly turned. She swallowed hard, her lips pressed together. Matteo was still silent. He stood at the doorframe, hands resting loosely at his sides, jaw tight. He had seen children frightened by shadows before. He had seen Paolo startled by nightmares more than once. But this was different. He knew it. Sophia knelt beside her son, trying to offer comfort. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders, though the shaking did not stop. She could feel the subtle heat of his small body against hers, a fragile warmth in the cold night. "You're safe, Paolo," she whispered, though even she did not fully believe the words. "Not safe," he said, barely audible. He's here." She looked where he pointed. The room seemed empty. Shadows pooled near the corners as usual. The familiar furniture cast lines across the walls. The small window was closed, curtains drawn. Nothing. And yet, she knew. She knew it was not her imagination. She had seen it in the photograph. She had seen it before the glass was even fully unwrapped. That small face, perfectly still, perfectly pale, had already made its presence known, its eyes lifted toward her, even in the distance of the image. It had not been created by chemical reaction, by double exposure, by flaw or accident. It had been there all along. Now it had crossed the threshold from image to reality. Or perhaps it had never left. Perhaps it had always been in the room, only waiting for someone to see it fully. Paolo shivered against her shoulder. It's moving," he said, voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. Sophia's heart pounded. She did not flinch. She could not. She had seen enough, known enough, that fear had become recognition, an understanding that some things were inevitable. Matteo stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. He placed one hand on Paolo's back. "There is no one here," he said. Words meant to comfort. Words meant to deny. Words meant to remind everyone that reality was still under control. Sophia did not respond. She did not correct him. She simply held her son, listening, waiting, watching, feeling the presence pressing against the edge of the room, small, patient, persistent. The boy's tears continued, hot and silent, falling down his cheeks. The room itself seemed to shift subtly, as if acknowledging his distress. Floorboards that had groaned in the past were quiet now. Only the faint creak of the bed frame hinted at the weight of whatever else shared the space. Sophia could not speak. She could only remember. The narrow chin, the faint mark near the left eye, the careful positioning, the cold, deliberate stillness. The eyes of the child in the photograph, wide and patient, aware, watching, waiting. And now, those same eyes were no longer trapped in glass. She shivered, not from cold, though the room had grown perceptibly cooler in the last moments. She shivered from knowing that recognition was not choice. It was surrender. The child's presence filled the corners of the room, not aggressively, not threateningly, but intimately, unavoidably. It occupied the space around Paolo without pressing upon him. except through sight, through subtle tension, through acknowledgement. Sophia understood this immediately. She understood because she had seen it before. Matteo still insisted it was nonsense. He tried to redirect Paolo's attention. He tried to dismiss what could not be dismissed. He folded the photograph once more, almost violently this time, as if the action itself could erase truth. But truth does not fold. Truth waits. Paolo curled against his mother, eyes wide, breathing ragged. "He's here," the boy whispered again, more urgently. "Right there, looking at me, watching me sleep." Sophia could feel it, the presence just beyond the blanket's edge. Patient, small, unblinking, damp, earthy, real. She pressed a hand against Paolo's chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat. The rhythm matched her own. She held him silently, rocking gently, unwilling to speak further, unwilling to give voice to what they all knew, because to speak it aloud would be to invite it closer, and recognition, as she had learned, is not always comforting. Over the next days, the Bianchi house began to feel different, not immediately, not in ways that anyone outside might notice, but inside, those who lived there felt it in the subtle shifts, the pauses between familiar sounds, the slight tilts in shadows that seemed to linger longer than natural light allowed. The photograph did not remain where it had been placed. Sophia first noticed it on the kitchen shelf, where she had set it carefully after breakfast. She remembered placing it there herself. The next morning, it was on the dining table. By afternoon, it rested on a small chair in the corner of the front room, always upright, always facing inward toward the heart of the house, always as if it had been watching. No one else acknowledged the movement. Matteo saw it once and dismissed it as a trick of sight, or perhaps fatigue from the early hours in the fields. The children did not comment, though Luca's eyes lingered longer than usual whenever the image caught his gaze. Sophia, however, felt the photograph differently. She did not measure its movement with curiosity. She measured it with recognition. Each time she saw it, the extra face seemed closer, not larger, not sharper, not brighter, but nearer. It was as though the house itself were bending space, pulling the image closer to her, reducing the distance that separated observer and presence. She could feel it even when she turned her back. The photograph occupied more of her awareness than its physical size allowed. She began noticing other changes in the house. Doors she was certain she had closed fully were slightly ajar. Floorboards she had never heard creak whispered under invisible weight. Curtains that had been drawn tight during the day moved subtly, brushing against walls without wind to explain it. At night, the most pronounced changes occurred. It began with the footsteps. They were never heavy, not like a grown man's boots against stone, not like Matteo pacing in frustration. They were measured, deliberate, slow, like a child learning the rhythm of a room that was not entirely its own. At first, Sophia attributed the sounds to imagination, to creaking wood, to rats. She had lived in the house for years. She knew how stone and timber spoke when they settled, but these footsteps were different. They had purpose, patience. They followed no predictable path. They paused. They returned. They sometimes hesitated outside her bedroom door. And then came the breathing, slow, deep, patient, always beside her bed, always when the house was silent. She lay awake for hours, listening, counting each inhale and exhale, wondering if she had imagined it. But the sound persisted, rising and falling, with a rhythm no ordinary occupant could produce. Paolo's small cries from the previous night had stopped, yet his presence no longer provided comfort. Sophia's attention had shifted entirely. She became hyper-aware of her own body in the room, the placement of her hands, the pressure of the mattress beneath her, the faint chill in the air. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. She did not speak of it to Matteo. She had learned long ago that naming such things could invite worse consequences. Instead, she whispered to herself fragments of prayer and caution, careful not to breathe too loudly. The house was aware. It responded to her attention. When she lingered in one room too long, she would find the photograph closer than it had been moments before. When she left a door open, she would return to find it closed. When she avoided looking, the house pressed nearer, compelling her gaze toward the image she did not want to see. She began to see other presences, subtle at first, shadows that did not match the contours of furniture, shapes that seemed to linger in corners just out of direct sight, reflections in polished surfaces that moved independently of reality, always subtle, always half-glimpsed, enough to provoke unease, but never enough to force confrontation. One evening, Sophia placed the photograph on a small table near the fireplace. The room was dim, the embers low, the children asleep. She sat near it, keeping her hands folded, watching. The extra face was not smiling, it was not frowning. It simply existed, waiting, aware. She felt its attention, even through the thickness of the glass, as if recognition were a living thing capable of extending itself beyond its medium. She dared not speak its name, for she had learned from Paolo that acknowledgement summoned presence. And yet, the longer she looked, the more she understood that the house itself was a vessel for memory, grief, and unspoken things. The next night, the breathing returned. She felt it brush the edges of her awareness before it reached her ears, not in the bed itself, but near it, on the floor, in the shadow cast by the wooden frame, slow, waiting, patient. She held her breath, wishing it away, willing it to be a trick of imagination, but she knew it was real. Hours passed. The sound was steady, pacing, unchanging. Finally, after what seemed like eternity, she whispered the name she had never spoken aloud. It left her lips without thought, barely a sound, yet deliberate in the quiet room. The breathing stopped instantly. Sophia exhaled, though it was a tentative, trembling exhale. Relief was fleeting. Immediately after, something shifted on the opposite side of the room. Not heavy, not abrupt, but a subtle exhalation, a rush of air, a presence acknowledging her act. The house had noticed. It waited. And now it responded. The room, once ordinary and predictable, became alive in ways she could no longer ignore. Floorboards no longer simply bore weight. They carried intention. Shadows no longer simply fell. They lingered. Doors no longer simply opened and closed. They moved with deliberate choice. Sophia began to notice the photograph's small, uncanny influence over her own perception. When she left it alone for a moment, she felt its absence, the empty space it should occupy. When she returned, it seemed to have moved, subtle but deliberate, always turning inward, always facing toward her, as if it understood where attention was most concentrated. Even Matteo began to sense the tension, though he never admitted it. He muttered about fatigue, about overwork in the terraces. But Sophia could see it in his eyes, the quick glances, the hesitation in the hall, the sudden tightening of his jaw when he passed the photograph. And the children, though oblivious to the full truth, sensed the change in ways they could not articulate. Paolo would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, muttering to an empty corner. Luca would pause, mid-task, staring briefly at a shadow before looking away. Emilia would avoid a certain room altogether, dragging her feet along the threshold as though crossing a border she could not name. The house itself had become an observer and an active participant. It responded to curiosity, to denial, to fear, to acknowledgement. It did not rush. It did not intrude violently, but it pressed imperceptibly, insistently, until those who dwelled within could no longer ignore its presence. Sophia understood now what the photograph had truly been, not an image, not merely a memory, a catalyst, a bridge, a witness that had waited decades, that had pressed against the edges of perception, that had demanded recognition before it could rest. And the house had accepted it. The family could no longer ignore the truth. Every night, every shift in the shadows, every whisper of movement reminded them, what is unacknowledged is not gone. The house did not sleep. It waited, it counted, it remembered. And for Sophia, the only relief came in moments like that fleeting night when she spoke the name aloud, when recognition was granted, when the breathing stopped. But even then, she knew there was always the other side of the room, always the exhale that she did not feel until it had passed. Always the silent acknowledgement that the house and the presence it had held all these years would never forget. The next morning, the sun rose reluctantly over the hills near Lucca, bathing the village in pale, washed-out light. Birds called, unaware of the tension building in one small house on the edge of the village. The priest arrived shortly after first light, his cassock brushing the dusty floorboards, the heavy weight of authority in every measured step. He had been called reluctantly. Matteo and Sophia had avoided him at first, attempting to handle what had happened within the walls of their home themselves. But the events of the past week, footsteps in the hall, the breathing by the bed, Paolo's small cries, had become impossible to ignore. The priest carried a small vial of holy water, a crucifix in one hand, and a collection of muted, worn prayers on his lips. He had seen many things in his time, sickness, madness, misfortune, but nothing had prepared him for the Bianchi photograph. He entered the front room quietly. The house smelled faintly of damp earth, lingering in corners where light dared not reach. He paused near the threshold. The photograph rested on the table, unwrapped now, the extra face staring quietly back at him. He looked at it for longer than necessary, long enough to feel the weight of grief and denial that had gathered in the room over the years, long enough to see the child who had never been named, never acknowledged, never permitted to exist. The priest shook his head subtly, whispering prayers he had memorized decades ago. He reached for the vial of holy water, his hand trembling, but stopped before touching the glass. Some things, he said softly, are not souls. Some things are not spirits that linger for vengeance or comfort. Some things are impressions left behind by grief, by denial, by the refusal to witness what had entered the world and then been buried, forgotten, erased in memory, but never in existence. He looked at Sophia. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, knuckles white. Her eyes were wide, filled with understanding that went far beyond what the priest could explain. She did not speak. The priest exhaled slowly, feeling the impossible weight of what he faced. He was a man of God, trained in ritual, equipped with the authority of centuries. But this was beyond his teachings, beyond the sacraments, beyond the prayers that had guided him through countless funerals, blessings, and exorcisms. It was not evil, not in the traditional sense, not something he could command to leave. It was unfinished. The photograph, he realized, was a record of refusal and recognition. It had captured a child who had been denied existence. It had captured grief that had not been fully witnessed. And it had made a home of the Bianchi house. The priest's hands fell from the vial. His eyes lingered over the extra face once more. It did not flinch. It did not react. It merely existed, patient, still, undeniable. "We cannot bless this," he said finally, voice low, almost breaking. "It is not what we can call holy or unholy. It is awareness, observation, witness, and it does not bend to ritual." Sophia's throat tightened. She had been preparing herself for absolution, for resolution, for some sense of divine intervention. But now she understood. There would be no reprieve, no comfort. The priest continued. His voice grew firmer, steadier. "Some things must be addressed by acknowledgement, not by force, not by water or word. You cannot erase what has been seen. You cannot undo what has already entered your life, even by mistake or denial." He stood in silence for a moment, the house itself seeming to listen, to hold its breath. Floorboards that had creaked under the weight of invisible footsteps now lay quiet, almost reverent. Shadows pressed against the corners of the room, long and patient, aware of the authority present, and yet unconcerned. Then, quietly, the priest suggested a method he felt might offer some sense of closure, however temporary. "The fire," he said, "if it is destroyed, if it is reduced to ash, then perhaps the house will no longer have reason to linger. It will remember, yes, but it will no longer hold your attention, your fear, your acknowledgement as focus. Place it in the fire at dawn. Witness it burn, and pray that what remains is less than what is seen." Sophia and Matteo followed his instructions without question. The air in the house was thick with anticipation, the kind that presses against the skin, that raises goose flesh even when the temperature is mild. That night, they prepared a small fire in the courtyard, a shallow pit lined with stones, sufficient for ritual, but not grand ceremony. The photograph was placed gently into the flames. It cracked immediately, the edges curling as the glass heated, silver flecks flaring briefly like sparks of forbidden light. Sophia watched, knuckles white, lips pressed together. She did not speak. Matteo stood behind her, shoulders tense, jaw tight. He had doubted the photograph at first, had called it nonsense. But now, in the flickering glow of firelight, he understood the weight of what had been captured. The photograph burned slowly. The edges bubbled, the image distorted by heat. Faces merged into indistinct smudges. The extra child's gaze twisted into a blur, leaving only a suggestion of shape, an echo of awareness. And yet, when the fire died, when the embers cooled and the flames no longer licked the night air, a shard of glass remained. A single face, unharmed. The shard was small, almost insignificant in size, but impossible to ignore. The extra face stared from within it, as if the fire had merely outlined it more sharply. It did not flinch. It did not change. The priest leaned closer. He examined it silently. Even he could not explain it. The shard contained the same awareness as the photograph had. It had survived, unscathed, a fragment of truth that refused obliteration. "This is what remains when acknowledgement is denied," he whispered. Not to the family, not aloud, but to himself. Grief that has not been named, presence that has not been recognized. Sophia reached out trembling and touched the shard. Her fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface. The eyes of the child seemed to flicker ever so slightly in the low light. Matteo pulled back instinctively. It's nothing," he said again. But even he knew the words were hollow. The priest shook his head. "It is something beyond our control, something that has entered your lives and refused to leave. We cannot bless it. We cannot curse it. We cannot command it to move. Only time or understanding might change its relation to you." The family felt the weight of his words. The photograph had been burned, the ritual completed, and yet what they saw in the shard confirmed what they had suspected all along. Some things are impervious to authority, impervious to explanation, impervious to control. The house, too, seemed aware. Shadows lingered longer. Floorboards groaned quietly, almost impatiently. The air felt thicker, heavier, and somehow charged. That night, Sophia dreamed of the child. Not a nightmare in the conventional sense, but a visitation. She saw the pale face, small and still, staring at her with eyes that had waited long enough to be patient. She heard the soft inhalation of breath. She felt the presence on the other side of the room, where the shard had been placed carefully on the mantel. Paolo slept soundly that night, untouched by the visitation. But Sophia understood. He had glimpsed it. The house remembered, the shard remembered, and the family, unwilling or unable to speak of it, would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The priest left shortly after dawn, leaving the family with the shard. He said no blessing, no final words of comfort, only a quiet caution. Some impressions cannot be exorcised, only endured. The Bianchis stood in the courtyard, the fire reduced to ash and stone, staring at the remaining fragment of glass. It was small, fragile, unassuming, and yet it held the entire weight of what had occurred. A face that should not have been, captured in silver and preserved in memory. A presence that survived fire, authority, ritual, a fragment of grief and denial made tangible. Sophia placed it carefully back inside the house, somewhere central, somewhere visible, somewhere it could not be ignored. The house, as if satisfied by this acknowledgement, shifted subtly. The shadows receded slightly. The cold did not press so sharply. The small footsteps and breathing, once constant, seemed to pause. But even as she felt a measure of temporary relief, Sophia knew it would never be truly gone. Some things once seen cannot be unseen. Some presences, once acknowledged, refuse erasure. The shard remained. The face remained. And the Bianchi family, bound by recognition, terror, and understanding, remained with it. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping over the hills near Lucca with an icy wind that cut through the olive terraces and rattled the shutters of the Bianchi house. The landscape was muted, gray, and brittle. Even the few trees that held onto leaves seemed to shiver under the weight of frost. Inside the house, however, warmth persisted in faint measures. Fires stoked carefully in the hearths, the children huddled under blankets. But it was a fragile warmth, constantly threatened by the cold that pressed from the outside and, more subtly, from the presence they could not banish. Paolo became quieter as the days grew shorter. At first, it was small things. He no longer laughed as readily when Luca teased him. He no longer reached for Emilia's hand in play. He would sit for long stretches, staring at nothing in particular, his small body curled slightly inward, as if to contain himself. Sophia noticed it immediately. She had seen death before, had handled grief, but this was different. There was no fever, no rash, no telltale sign of illness. The boy did not cough. He did not cry from pain. His body simply began to recede from the world around him. The doctor arrived after a neighbor insisted that something must be done. He was a man of reason, with spectacles perched carefully on his nose and a coat that smelled faintly of herbs and ink. He examined Paolo meticulously. He took his pulse, listened to his lungs, checked for fever, for infection, for anything visible, anything ordinary. He found nothing. "There is nothing," the doctor admitted finally, voice low, unsure. "He is simply fading, slowly, inexplicably. There is no cause that I can identify, no disease, no injury, nothing we can treat." Sophia did not flinch. She had been expecting this, though the anticipation did not make it easier. She had watched the photograph, the shard, the extra face. She had listened to the breathing, the small footsteps, the patient waiting. She had understood that there is a cost to recognition. Some presences demand a balance. Paolo's fading was that balance. Days turned into weeks. His hair lost its luster. His skin became paler, almost translucent in the candlelight. His small hands seemed fragile, weightless. His voice, once bright and curious, became soft, hesitant, distant. He moved through the house like a shadow of himself, always aware, always quietly observing the spaces that the photograph had touched. Sophia watched him constantly. She did not interfere. She did not plead. She did not cry. She simply allowed the inevitable to proceed. The household adapted to this slow disappearance. Meals were quiet. Voices were measured. Luca and Emilia learned to tread lightly, to speak softly, to pretend that Paolo's absence was merely a matter of his attention wandering. Matteo, once insistent that the photograph was nonsense, now avoided discussion entirely, his jaw set and his eyes shadowed with the understanding he refused to name. At night, Sophia would sit by Paolo's bedside, holding his hand, feeling the diminishing warmth, tracing the faint pulse beneath his fragile skin. She whispered the child's name softly, sometimes murmuring prayers, sometimes recounting memories of the boy when he was bright and alive. He did not respond most nights, only listened, only allowed her presence. She understood better than anyone that Paolo had become a vessel for what the photograph had demanded. The extra face the child denied, the presence that lingered beyond life. It required a place in the world. It required acknowledgement. It required, ultimately, substitution. And Paolo was that substitution. One night, the wind howled through the hills, rattling the shutters and lifting the edges of thin curtains. The house seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, the same slow, patient breathing that had haunted the nights before. Sophia leaned closer to Paolo, brushing his pale hair from his forehead. He looked at her then, eyes wide, filled with the soft, surreal luminescence of someone caught between worlds. His voice was a whisper. "She is here." Sophia nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. She did not speak further. There was no need. The child in the photograph, preserved in glass, had crossed over in some subtle, ineffable way, and Paolo, fading from the living, was making room. The house itself seemed to acknowledge the transition. Shadows that had lingered unnaturally in corners softened. Footsteps and breathing ceased. The shard of glass, still carefully placed on the mantel, reflected only the firelight now, the extra face no longer appearing to move closer, only observing with serene patience. Days passed. Paolo's form grew lighter, more fragile. He no longer needed assistance walking. He seemed to float, drifting along the edges of rooms, whispering at the corners where no one else could see. When the final moment arrived, it was quiet. Sophia had anticipated it. She held his hand in both of hers, pressing her cheek to the top of his head, feeling the last warmth fading. His breathing slowed, his lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. And then he was gone. No scream, no fevered cry, no convulsion, just a soft exhalation, like the release of a breath held too long. Sophia did not cry. She did not sob. She did not scream. She only said, softly, almost reverently, "She won't be alone anymore." The words were simple. The sound carried across the quiet house, mingling with the faint scent of damp earth that had haunted the bedrooms since the photograph first appeared. The house seemed to shift slightly, almost in approval, settling into a measured silence that had never before been possible. Luca and Amelia were too young to fully understand, but they sensed the finality in the atmosphere. They did not ask questions. They merely accepted the emptiness in the place where Paolo had been, as if they knew that he had become something beyond them, something necessary. Matteo, standing in the corner of the room, finally allowed himself a long, slow exhale. The weight he had carried, denial, disbelief, fear, lifted just enough for him to see what had transpired. The house had demanded balance, and balance had been achieved. The original photograph no longer exists, or rather, it exists only in memory and in fragments of recollection, whispered accounts from those who witnessed its presence long ago. The wooden camera that captured it, the glass plate that bore the image, the Bianchi family home where the presence lingered, all have faded into history, reduced to vague recollections in the minds of villagers, or lost entirely to time. But the story did not end there. A copy of the photograph survived, not the original glass plate, not the shard that had remained after the fire, but a copy, small, imperfect, unassuming. It had been stored in Florence, in a private collection maintained by a man who collected curiosities, oddities, and artifacts whose histories had become tangled in rumor and superstition. The photograph itself had been mislabeled, cataloged incorrectly as a portrait of a Bianchi family, early 20th century. There was nothing to suggest on first glance that it was extraordinary, nothing to indicate that it had been the source of grief, dread, and subtle horror that had haunted a household decades ago. Most visitors to the collection saw it and walked away. It hung quietly in a darkened cabinet, surrounded by other images, other objects, all bearing the muted glow of time's passage. But for some, the photograph drew attention. Not overtly. There were no alarms, no sensations of heat or cold, but subtly, imperceptibly. Those who paused before it found themselves lingering longer than they intended. Eyes traced the familiar poses of the family, the careful arrangement of figures, the soft curves of clothing and background, and then, inevitably, the gaze drifted to the extra face. It was subtle at first, a child's face, pale, indistinct among the 5 ordinary figures, eyes wide, small mouth slightly parted. Its gaze was not toward the camera, not toward the viewer, but aimed at a point just beyond comprehension. It was as if the face had always been waiting for someone to notice it. Many who saw it for the first time felt a mild disquiet, a vague sense that something was wrong, a flicker of recognition they could not name. Most turned away quickly, rationalizing it as a trick of light, a smudge in the photograph, a curiosity that was overemphasized by the imagination. But some lingered. Those who lingered too long reported the same detail. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the extra face began to resemble something familiar. Not the original child, not Paolo, not the Bianchi family, but themselves. The longer they looked, the more the features, the narrow chin, the slight curve of the lips, the pale skin, the attentive, patient eyes, shifted toward their own reflection in the glass. It was subtle at first. The shift was not violent, not grotesque. It was almost polite, a quiet suggestion that recognition was inevitable, that awareness was a choice, but only for so long. Some described a prickle of cold along their spine. Others felt a deep, sinking sensation, as if gravity itself had changed beneath them. The eyes that waited, were patient, gentle in their scrutiny, but unyielding. They observed without judgment, without malice, yet with a certainty that the observer could not escape. Most people stopped looking before they understood why. A part of them recognized something essential in the gaze, a truth that was too difficult to acknowledge. Because once you recognize yourself, the photograph does not merely record your acknowledgement, it counts it. The extra face does not forgive, it does not forget, it does not release. It keeps an account, silent, accurate, patient. Collectors who had examined the photograph reported strange effects over time. Some described dreams of small children standing at the edges of rooms, watching. Others spoke of shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should, corners of rooms where nothing should exist. A faint scent of damp earth, faintly familiar, would appear in bedrooms, libraries, or offices, always brief, always gone before it could be fully traced. A few, braver or more foolish, decided to study the photograph over long periods. They reported a subtle pressure, as if the room around them had shifted, as if the very air remembered the presence captured within the silvered plate. One man, a historian specializing in European photographic archives, claimed that after hours of study, he found himself blinking rapidly, seeing his own features emerge subtly within the extra child's face. "I don't know how it happened," he whispered in a letter years later, preserved in the archive's notes. "I didn't move, I didn't touch it, but the face, it shifted. It became mine. And then I stopped before I knew too much. I couldn't look any longer." That is the way the photograph operates. It waits, it observes, it is patient beyond comprehension. It does not force the viewer to witness more than they can bear, but it allows the mind to wander, the recognition to arise, until awareness itself becomes an unavoidable truth. Some scholars have tried to rationalize it. Double exposure, retouching, optical illusion, chemical anomalies in the silver nitrate. Each explanation is insufficient. Each ignores the consistent reports of the sensation, the shift, the small, patient gaze that waits for acknowledgement. Because the photograph does not simply depict reality, it preserves it. It preserves what has been denied. what has been overlooked, what has been refused attention, and therefore remains. Those who see it fully, who allow their eyes to linger too long, sometimes vanish from ordinary accounts. Not in a way that can be documented, not in a way that invites investigation. They simply leave. Letters stop arriving, diaries are abandoned, appointments missed. Only faint whispers remain in the memories of those who knew them, the same sensation of a presence, patient, pale, silent, waiting. Florence, for all its art, its history, its quiet cafes and cobbled streets, is unaware of the small horrors it holds in private collections. Tourists do not see the photograph. Scholars do not notice the extra face in passing records. Yet it exists, patiently catalogued, rarely displayed, waiting for the next observer whose gaze will be too long. Time does not diminish the photograph's power. The decades, the centuries, the fading of the world around it, none of it matters. The extra face is timeless. Its awareness is unbound by the mortality of those who view it. Some viewers, braver than most, have left written accounts. Their stories vary, but the pattern is always the same. Recognition arises slowly, a sense of familiarity, a subtle prickle in the nerves. The longer one studies the extra face, the more it shifts toward the observer. Features adjust without conscious movement, as if the photograph itself is alive to perception. Before full understanding, the observer's curiosity is checked by instinct, fear, or conscience. Most look away. Most do not return. Those who cannot resist, who linger too long, are said to disappear from normal accounts, absorbed into the presence they have recognized. The shard in Lucca, the memory of Paolo, the burned photograph. These are all remnants of the same process. They are evidence that recognition comes at a cost. That acknowledgement is never neutral. That some things once seen are counted, and that count is precise, inexorable, and eternal. And so the copy remains. It waits, patiently, quietly. Somewhere in Florence, behind locked glass, among other artifacts of forgotten lives, it hangs, almost ordinary, unassuming, silent, until someone notices it. And then, inevitably, the recognition begins. Most stop before it is complete. Most cannot bear the knowledge that the extra face, the face waiting, patient, aware, may be theirs. That lingering moment of recognition is enough. The photograph counts it, stores it, holds it in its careful, patient memory. Because once you see it, truly see it, it is already too late. It has counted you. And like the Bianchi family, like Paolo, like the forgotten child who never lived in the world but survived in memory, you become part of its measure. The photograph does not move. It does not breathe. And yet, it is alive. It waits. It remembers. It preserves. And when the next observer lingers too long, it will do exactly the same again. Some families are remembered for who they were. Their faces remain fixed in albums and frames, unchanged by time. Their stories end where the photograph ends, contained, complete, finished. Others are remembered for who they refuse to acknowledge, for the names never spoken, for the spaces left empty on purpose, for the moments they believed could be buried and forgotten. The Bianchi family believed silence was enough. They believed that 8 seconds of stillness ended when the shutter closed, that a child buried without bells could not return, that a photograph captured only what stood in the light. But the image did not forget. It remembered the cold that crossed the floor, the face that appeared without invitation, the recognition that arrived without words, the house that listened, the authority that turned away, the balance that was taken instead of given. Fire reduced the photograph to ash, but it did not resolve it. Because the problem was never the glass. It was the refusal to see. Impressions left by denial do not vanish. They wait. They wait in mislabeled archives, in images viewed too long, in the quiet moment when familiarity replaces fear. Because the extra face was never meant to belong to the past. It exists where recognition has been delayed, where something entered the world and was never acknowledged long enough to be released. And when that recognition finally happens, the photograph does not change. The count does. Some families are remembered for who they were, others for who they refused to acknowledge, and some photographs are still waiting to be finished.